Inside the back of a black Buick, a man sits perfectly still. He's wearing the gray-blue uniform of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. His eyes are covered by a thick black blindfold. He can't see the trees of the Virginia forest passing by, but he can smell the damp brackish air of the Potomac River. He's 4,000 miles from home. He thinks he's in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The car stops. Rough hands guide him out. He's led to a room that smells of tobacco and floor wax. The blindfold is whipped away. Standing before him is a young American soldier. The soldier looks him in the eye and begins to speak. He doesn't bark orders. He doesn't scream. He speaks in the refined upper-class German of a Berliner. He asks the commander about his family. He offers him a cigarette. The commander doesn't know it yet, but he's at Post Office Box 1142, and the man across from him is a Jewish refugee who fled Germany just years earlier to escape the death camps. Now the roles have reversed. The refugee is the interrogator, and the Nazi is the source. Welcome to World War II Obscura. 12 miles from the Pentagon and 14 miles from the U.S. Capitol, a secret was buried for over 60 years. To the local residents of Alexandria, Virginia, Fort Hunt was just an old coastal defense post from the Spanish-American War. But during the height of World War II, it was the most important intelligence gathering site on American soil. It didn't exist on any map. It had no official name. It was known only by a post office box number. Between 1943 and 1946, nearly 3,500 German prisoners passed through these gates, including 15 high-ranking Nazi generals. The story of what happened behind these fences was so sensitive that the men who worked here were sworn to secrecy for life. The men who ran this facility were part of a specialized group, often called the Ritchie Boys, named after their training ground at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. Many were German and Austrian Jews who had seen the writing on the wall in the 1930s. They'd watched their businesses be seized, their families harassed, and their homes destroyed. They fled to America with nothing but their lives and their language. When the U.S. entered the war, the Army realized these refugees possessed a weapon more powerful than a Sherman tank. They knew the German mind. They didn't just speak the language. They understood the nuances of German culture, the ego of a Prussian officer corps, and the cracks in the Nazi facade. But there was a catch. The U.S. War Department was adamant about one thing: no physical torture. In an era where the Gestapo was synonymous with the rack and the boot, the Americans at P.O. Box 1142 decided to try something radical. They would be gentlemen. They would use psychology and empathy to break the will of the Third Reich's elite. One of these men was Fred Michel. Like many of his colleagues, Fred was sworn to such absolute secrecy that he didn't even tell his wife what he did during the war. For decades, he kept the stories of P.O. Box 1142 locked away, believing he would take them to his grave. It wasn't until 2006 when a National Park Service historian confronted him with declassified transcripts bearing his own signature that the floodgates finally opened. What Fred and his fellow interrogators described was a battle of wits. They would start with soft interrogation. Imagine a German general, a man who expected to be beaten or executed upon capture. Instead, he's given a comfortable room. He's given real coffee and fresh fruit. An interrogator like Rudy Penns might sit down with him for a game of chess. As the pieces moved across the board, the conversation would drift. They would talk about the opera in Berlin or the architecture of Munich. The interrogator would listen for nuggets, the name of a mistress, a grievance against a superior officer, the technical detail about a new torpedo. The Germans, often overwhelmed by their own egos and the surprising kindness of their captors, would begin to talk. They wanted to show off how much they knew. They wanted to prove they were still important. To further break down their defenses, the Americans would sometimes take these high-ranking Nazis on field trips. They would drive them into the heart of Washington, D.C., taking them to high-end department stores like Garfinkel's. The prisoners were bought civilian clothes, tailored suits, and fine leather shoes to replace their tarnished uniforms. They were taken to the movies and out for state dinners. It was calculated as a psychological weapon. By treating them as peers, as human beings, the interrogators created a sense of obligation. The prisoners felt a debt of gratitude, and in the polite conversation that followed, they would reveal secrets that were winning the war. If a prisoner was particularly stubborn, the Ritchie Boys turned to theater. Enter the monitoring room, located in a building that nicknamed Honeysuckle. Every prisoner's cell at Fort Hunt was bugged. The microphones were hidden in the light fixtures, the walls, and even the bed frames. Soldiers with headsets sat in darkened rooms nearby, pens poised over notebooks, listening for every whisper. The most effective trick was the roommate method. The Americans would place two high-ranking officers in a cell together. The officers, believing they were in a secure environment, would immediately begin to argue. "Why did you surrender the fortress?" one would hiss. "The Fuhrer will have your head," the other would reply. In the process of blaming each other, they would reveal troop movements, the locations of secret bunkers, and the devastating impact of Allied bombing raids. Men in Honeysuckle building heard it all. They heard the generals lamenting the loss of the U-boats. They heard the technical specifications of new jet engines, and they heard the admissions of war crimes that the prisoners thought they were taking to their graves. But what about the hardcore Nazis, the SS officers who wouldn't be swayed by a game of chess or a hidden mic? For them, the Americans had a darker, more terrifying character waiting in the wings. They called it the Russian threat. During the war, there was nothing a German soldier feared more than being captured by the Soviet Union. The rumors of the Eastern Front were horrific. The interrogators at P.O. Box 1142 leaned into this fear with clinical precision. They recruited two Russian-American soldiers, Alexander Dolin and Alex Shidlovsky. These men were tall, imposing, and spoke fluent guttural Russian. They were dressed in authentic Red Army uniforms, complete with the red star and the rough wool of a Soviet officer. When a German prisoner refused to cooperate, the American interrogator would sigh, look at his watch. Well, he would say in German, "We've tried to be reasonable, but our treaty with the Soviet Union requires us to hand over uncooperative prisoners for special processing to Siberia." Then on cue, there would be a heavy knock at the door. Dallin would stomp in the room, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He would bark a command in Russian and look at the prisoner with cold, predatory eyes. The effect was almost instantaneous. Prisoners who had been silent for days would suddenly collapse, begging to stay in American custody. They would offer up everything they knew: U-boat frequencies, jet engine designs, the names of spies, anything to avoid being handed over to Ivan. As the war entered its final months, the mission at P.O. Box 1142 took a darker, more complex turn. The focus shifted from winning the war to winning the post-war scientific future. This was the dawn of Operation Paperclip. A new breed of prisoner began to arrive at the secret fort. Not soldiers, but scientists. Some were geniuses, but many were monsters. Imagine the internal struggle of a Jewish interrogator sitting across the table from Otto Ambros. Ambros was a brilliant chemist, the co-discoverer of sarin gas. He was so favored by the Nazi regime that Hitler personally awarded him 1 million Reichsmarks for his work on synthetic rubber. But Ambros was also the manager of the IG Farben slave labor factory at Auschwitz. He'd overseen the deaths of thousands of prisoners. Now here he was in Virginia, comfortable, smoking Lucky Strikes and sipping Jack Daniels whiskey. Then there was Dr. Kurt Blom, the Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich. He was a hardcore Nazi who experimented with weaponized bubonic plague and other biological agents on human beings. At P.O. Box 1142, the interrogation of men like Blom was no longer about traditional military secrets. It was a cold, pragmatic transaction. The U.S. military leadership, including men like Major General Hugh Kerr, was clear. Pride and face-saving have no place in national insurance. They believed that if the Americans didn't secure these scientists in their research, the Soviets would. The intelligence they held was seen as more valuable than the pursuit of justice for their crimes. As a personal privilege, I'd like to point out that argument is bullshit. The interrogation rooms were transformed into seminar spaces. Jewish soldiers who'd lost their families in the Holocaust found themselves serving coffee and providing writing materials to the men who designed the machinery of the Nazi genocide. Moral tension was so thick you could choke on it. One soldier, Henry Colm, recalled the visceral frustration of seeing unrepentant Nazis being groomed for high-paying jobs in the American defense industry. He watched as they were given the best food and allowed to stroll the grounds of Fort Hunt as if it were a private country club. Among them was Werner von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket. While he was at the fort, he wasn't treated as a war criminal who utilized slave labor at the Norhausen underground factory. He was treated as a visionary. His rockets had rained death on London. But to the men at P.O. Box 1142, he was our ticket to the stars. The Ritchie Boys had to swallow their pride and their grief to facilitate this transition. They were professionals, and their job was to ensure that the scientific spoils of the Third Reich fell into American hands. The intelligence gathered through these methods, both the soft psychological gains and the cynical scientific recruitments, was staggering. One major success involved the U-505, the German submarine captured by the U.S. Navy. The crew was brought to P.O. Box 1142. Through careful interrogation, the Ritchie Boys extracted the secrets of the German acoustic torpedo. By understanding how the torpedo heard its targets, the U.S. developed sonic countermeasures that saved countless lives in the Atlantic. Another group at the fort worked for Military Insurance or Military Intelligence Research Service, or MIRS. These men, like Paul Fairbrook, didn't interrogate people. They interrogated paper. They took tons of captured German documents, everything from laundry lists to high-level commands, and painstakingly reconstructed the German order of battle. They created the Red Book, the comprehensive guide that told Allied commanders exactly which German units were in front of them and how many tanks they had left. It was the ultimate cheat sheet for the invasion of Europe. Yet for all its importance, P.O. Box 1142 was destined to be forgotten. When the camp closed in 1946, the order was given to erase it. The interrogation buildings were bulldozed into the Virginia soil. Listening devices were ripped out and destroyed. The records were either burned or buried deep in archives. The soldiers were given a final stern warning. What you saw here, what you did here, stays here. Speak of it and you face treason. For 60 years, that silence held. Families picnicked on the grassy fields of Fort Hunt Park, unaware that beneath their feet were the foundations of the rooms where the secrets of the V-2 rocket and the blueprints of the Cold War were extracted. One of those surreal moments in the fort's history involves Peter Weiss, the young Jewish soldier working in intelligence in the camp. One afternoon, he was hitchhiking on the George Washington Memorial Parkway trying to get into D.C. The car pulled over to give him a ride. He climbed in only to realize he was sitting next to Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of the Supreme Allied Commander. It was a moment that illustrated the proximity of this top-secret operation to the very highest levels of power. The world's most dangerous secrets were being unraveled just a few miles from where its leaders of the free world slept. P.O. Box 1142 proves that intelligence isn't just about force, it's about humanity and the complex, often messy reality of war. The Jewish refugees who ran the camp could have easily succumbed to the urge for vengeance. They could have used the same brutal methods the Nazis used on their people. Instead, they chose to be better. They used their minds, their empathy, and their shared culture to defeat an empire of hate. They showed that understanding your enemy is more effective than hurting them. But the story also forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of the post-war world. The intelligence they gathered shortened the war and saved thousands of lives, but it also required a deal with the devil. The scientific progress that put a man on the moon and developed modern medicine was built in part on the works of men who'd committed unspeakable crimes. The Ritchie Boys at Fort Hunt stood at the center of that moral storm. Fred Michel and his colleagues eventually received the recognition they deserved, but many died before the world knew their names. They were the quiet architects of victory working in the shadows of the Potomac. They carried the weight of the world's secrets and the personal grief of the Holocaust, yet they maintained their professionalism to the very end. The story of the Ritchie Boys at P.O. Box 1142 is a story of incredible moral discipline. In a time of total war, they affirmatively chose to fight with their minds instead of their fists. They proved that you could defeat an enemy without becoming them. We owe a great debt of gratitude to these men who turned their personal tragedy into a triumph that helped save the world. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think that I should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.